Today I want to talk about how you can stop sounding like a beginner guitarist. Now there are things that are really obvious like slow chord changes, general sloppiness, or a clear lack of technique, but that's not what this video is about. Instead, I want to focus on the little things, the tiny tells that give away that a guitar player might still have some work to do. The first thing that I'll notice is disjointed strumming, and this usually comes down to one main thing, and that is that you're holding the pick too tightly. So when you're first starting out, you're trying to just make sure that every strum is in time, right? So whether you're following a metronome or a drum beat or whatever, you're kind of just making sure, okay, I hit here, 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 here. A good way to think about your strumming is that it should flow kind of like waves on water. So they're not all perfectly the same, but they all flow into each other at a nice, consistent pace. And one of the best ways to make sure that your strumming is flowing is to relax. So you need to relax your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist, your hand, and your grip on the pick. A lot of newer players like thinner picks because they can hold the pick really tight, and when they drag it through the strings, it gives enough that it doesn't sound like you're just digging through those strings. Well, with proper technique, you're holding the pick looser, and when you hit those strings, you're letting the resistance from the strings push the pick so that it's at an angle. So when I play the strings like this, it doesn't sound crazy aggressive, even though I'm using a thicker pick. If I were to grip very tightly, well, it sounds ridiculous. And so what you want to do is make sure that whether you are going to use a thinner pick or a slightly thicker pick, that you're only holding the pick hard enough so that it doesn't bounce out of your hands. Relaxing that pick grip is going to make all of your other parts of your body relax as well. And then if you employ what I call the constant strumming technique, where your hand just kind of never stops moving, it's just bouncing with the beat, whether you're strumming or not, right? Like this. As long as you're doing that and everything is relaxed, your strumming is going to sound a lot smoother and much less disjointed. Next, we've got lack of muting, and this applies to both rhythm guitar and lead guitar, and it applies to both our strumming hand and our fretting hand. Now, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to muting, so I'm not going to really be able to cover everything in depth here. I will put any lessons that I have on muting under reference videos in the description below this video if you want to learn more about it. But just to kind of quickly go over some of the types of muting that we need to know. The first one is to mute with your left hand when you are playing chords. So for example, when we play the D chord, right, we don't want our E and A strings to come through. So we need to make sure either we are super accurate and don't hit those strings, or if we want to be relaxed and not have to worry about the accuracy with our picking hand, we want to make sure that we are muting those strings. So I use my thumb like this to mute those strings. Not everyone can do that. Some people will touch it with their pinky string like this, but doing this allows you to strum all the strings and not worry about those extra strings coming through. Other chords like the C major chord, we can either move our finger up even though it's fretting just to touch that low E so that it won't ring, right? We're just lightly touching it, or we can use a separate finger to lightly touch, or do the same with our thumb. We do the same thing when we're playing lead sometimes. So when we're playing in a pentatonic scale or whatever, we're playing a lick, we use our extra fingers or extra space on fingers that we are using just to lightly touch adjacent strings to make sure they don't accidentally come through. There's also muting with our right hand, which obviously just involves touching the strings here with our fingers, just to make sure that they stop when we want them to stop, or palm muting, where we use our palm to kind of come up and stop the strings from ringing here. The last kind of muting technique that I like to suggest to my students is to learn how to release pressure on their fingers so that their fingers don't fly away from the fretboard. And the reason for that is it gives us control over when a chord or a note starts and stops. So if we play this little chord right here and I release pressure, but I don't take my fingers off the strings, the chord just stops. Do the same with single notes. Just making sure that we stop that note from ringing through. Really important with genres like funk or reggae, where you want to be able to go, have the chord come through and immediately stop. Very, very useful technique. Like I said, there's a lot of muting to be done and a lot of little techniques and nuances to learn, but all of them are very important. The next thing is no use of velocity. Now, I have a video on my channel called How to Be a Great Rhythm Guitar Player, and the main focus or takeaway from that lesson is to play like a drummer. And what drummers do is they don't just see each individual thing that they can hit as just a thing that they can hit. They think about how hard am I going to hit that? And the variance and the different amounts of velocity that they use to hit gives them basically infinite options and sounds. We can do the same thing on guitar. If I don't just think of it as downstrokes and upstrokes, I can do all different types of things and create my own cool rhythmic patterns just by how hard I hit the strings and which strings I hit. This concept also applies to lead guitar as well. So when you're playing single notes, think about how hard you're playing each note. A lack of bending and vibrato control. I'm sure you've heard guitar players on the internet or elsewhere bend a note and not quite hit the note that they were aiming for. Now, something to keep in mind is that every guitar is gonna feel a little bit different. For example, a shorter scale length, the strings are gonna be a little bit looser, which means you don't need to apply as much pressure. Same goes for a Fender scale length, right? The longer scale length, well, your strings are gonna have a little bit more tension. Also, bigger gauge strings, they're gonna have more tension. So all of these things factor in. Also, just different guitars are gonna feel different. So getting comfortable with making sure that your bends are intonated properly is a skill that you'll want to work on. One of the best ways to work on this is just to pick a note, bend that note, and then check it with the note that you are bending up to. So for example, if I wanted to bend this A note up to this B note, I would do this. Just working on figuring out how much pressure I need to apply to make sure that I'm hitting the correct note. Now, something kind of related to this, but it's not really bending, is I see this with a lot of new players when they're playing lead stuff especially, but this can come through with like chords and stuff as well, is that when they are trying to push down on a note, they're trying to push kind of hard. And because they're pushing so hard, they'll slightly pull the string out of tune. So rather than playing, they'll play. You'll especially notice this if you record yourself and listen back. Kind of hard to notice when you're doing it on the fly. And then the other thing we need to talk about is vibrato. Now, there are so many right ways to do vibrato. Think about all the great players. They all have very different vibratos. And there's no kind of one way to do it, right? But one thing that we want to avoid is the erratic, inconsistent sounding vibrato. So again, something you see a lot of times in newer players when they are trying for the first time to kind of use vibrato is they'll have it come from their finger. Now there are ways to have the finger vibrato and it sound good, but what usually happens is it sounds like this. They kind of do this. And it's inconsistent because the amount of bending that you're doing, a little bit of bending is not quite right, and the pace is not quite right? The tempo of it. So what we want to do is eliminate that. The best way to do this is when you think of your vibrato, again, this isn't what you have to do, there's lots of ways to do it, but is rather than moving your finger, move your wrist. So kind of think of it as turning a doorknob, or shaking the whole neck all together like this. But the motion is coming from your wrist. Try and kind of lock your fingers a little bit. If you do work on this, it will help. Whether you do the shake like that, or the rotate with your wrist, it's gonna sound a little cleaner than trying to wiggle your finger in a consistent motion. Last up, we've got too many or not enough strings. So when it comes to too many strings, we have access to 6 strings. So when we play, let's say a G major bar chord, that chord right there has a ton of information in it, right? We've got all this stuff in the low end, the stuff in the middle, and then we've got all the high end stuff. Well, sometimes when we're playing with other guitar players, piano players, other instruments that take up the same sonic space, well, we want to make sure that we're not stepping on their toes and not muddying things up. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important for guitar players to learn triads, because rather than playing a big chord like that and being stuck playing a chord like that, you can play just enough notes to get your point across, right? The same information as far as the notes, all 3 important notes from that chord are right there, but now we don't have all this extra stuff going on. You might want that extra stuff, but it's important to have the option and to know how to have less of that where it's necessary. So learning how to play those triads is a really good place to start. Now, as far as not playing enough strings, this usually comes down to a lead guitar thing. So a lot of lead guitar players, they kind of have a switch in their brain where they go from rhythm mode to lead mode. They switch that switch, and then all of a sudden, all they can do is play single notes. Well, it's very important to learn how to add things like double stops, triads, and other chords into your lead playing. The best way to think about it is to not have a switch at all and just be able to kind of flow between rhythm mode, lead mode, and it kind of just all be one big hybrid mode. But if you do kind of have those modes, just adding double stops, triads, and things like that to your playing is going to be kind of the best place to start. So for example, if I were to play a part that's, I'm improvising something, let's say, right? And I'm in that A minor pentatonic position, rather than being locked to playing one note at a time, I can make my part sound more dynamic and more interesting by playing more than one note at a time. If you want to start using double stops in your playing, but you're not really sure where to get started, I do have a lesson that'll kind of get you off on the right foot. I'll make sure to link that in the description below under referenced videos. So I want to throw it back to you. What are some things that you notice in other players that makes them sound like they've still got some work to do? Leave it down in the comments below. As far as what's next, I'd recommend you check out my video on the Forever Beginner curse and how you can break it. If you want to check it out, I'm going to put a link up in the middle of the screen for you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.